Jake Paul and Nate Diaz had beef on Twitter, which led to Ben Askren calling out Nate Diaz for a fight. Dan Hooker plans to move down to the featherweight division, and the UFC 268 pay-per-view numbers have been released. I thought I'd break down all of these topics in today's MMA news reaction video, starting with Nate Diaz and Jake Paul getting into a beef on Twitter, and Ben Askren subsequently calling out Nate Diaz for a fight in the UFC. Let's start straight at the beginning. So Ben Askren was on Lex Friedman's podcast, and he mentioned his fight with Jake Paul. Of course, he's going to have to talk about that for the rest of his life on every single podcast that Ben Askren is ever on for the rest of his life. He will be asked about his loss to Jake Paul. It will haunt him forever. And he mentioned that Jake Paul is kind of a good boxer because, of course, afterwards, he went on to beat Tyron Woodley, and I'm sure that opened up a lot of people's eyes, including Ben Askren, to see that, hang on a second, Tyron Woodley's actually a decent striker, or was a decent striker for MMA, and Jake Paul's just beating him in a boxing match. So Ben Askren mentioned on Lex Friedman's podcast that Jake Paul is kind of a good boxer, which meant that Nate Diaz saw this quote from Ben Askren and said, "A compliment coming from a retired wrestler who can't fight or box." Burn, of course, from Nate Diaz against Ben Askren and subsequently against Jake Paul as well. He said, coming from a retired wrestler who can't fight or box was what he was going for, and Jake Paul then responded immediately to Nate Diaz, pouncing on this opportunity to make some headlines like he always does. And I know a lot of people don't like Jake Paul, but one thing you can't deny is the guy knows how to make headlines with everything he says. He knows when to jump in on Twitter and make this drama, and he responded to Nate Diaz by saying, "You have 6 times as many losses as Ben Askren. Let that sink in." You have 6 times as many losses as Ben Askren. Let that sink in. To which Nate Diaz then responded immediately afterwards. "You'd get smoked in a real fight though. You can't really fight. Boxing matches with wrestlers only. Let that sink in." Tyron Woodley's quite good at MMA striking though, I'm sure Nate Diaz can admit, but he can't give Jake Paul credit here. He has to keep the beef up because potentially this could be a boxing match down the line. Let's not forget, Nate Diaz is on his last fight of his contract. So after that, he could be looking at the Jake Paul boxing match as a quick payday for himself. So he's setting up a little bit of beef here on Twitter with Jake Paul. "You'd get smoked in a real fight though. You can't really fight. Boxing matches with wrestlers only. Let that sink in. Of course, Jake Paul's been setting up a lot of his boxing matches to where he has the favour over his opponent. He's usually bigger than his opponent. His opponent's usually not predominantly a boxer. Hasn't really done too many boxing training or boxing fights in their career at all. And that's how Jake Paul picks his fights. It's a genius way of doing things. He's finally taken on Tommy Fury, which is a big test for him. And after Nate Diaz responded that, Jake Paul responded again, "I own the entire city of Stockton. Let that sink in." A very Conor McGregor-esque response, if I do say so myself. I wouldn't even be surprised if McGregor actually said that in the build-up to the first Nate Diaz fight. He owns the entire city of Stockton, or maybe McGregor mentioned something like he could buy and sell your whole bum town. I think that's what he actually said, but Jake Paul's trolling Nate Diaz on Twitter here, getting him to respond, creating a bit of drama, stirring up the headlines, and potentially setting up a super fight for himself if Nate Diaz retires from the UFC after his last fight on his contract. But this also led to, outside of Jake Paul versus Nate Diaz, this led to Ben Askren jumping in afterwards to give his final message on the topic and said, "Nate is right. I suck at boxing. He sucks at MMA. If he wants me to prove it, I can be in the USADA pool tomorrow. Would be happy to be the last fight on his contract." I don't mind the idea of this, but I do understand that the UFC will never make this matchup happen. You want to know why? Nate Diaz has 1 fight guaranteed left with the UFC. That's all the UFC knows. We have Nate Diaz for his next fight. He might re-sign after that if we pay him enough, but we might never see Nate Diaz again after his last fight in the UFC. So, this is his last fight we've got him for. We're going to make the best out of this situation. They aren't going to make him versus Ben Askren. It just won't happen, because if Ben Askren beats Nate Diaz, he's going to dip out again and not come back to the UFC. If they have one more sacrifice of Nate Diaz to give a contender in the welterweight or lightweight division, they're not going to give it to someone who's not going to continue in the company. They're going to want to give it to someone like Vicente Luque. And this is why I don't understand how Nate Diaz is even having the audacity to say that Vicente Luque is ducking him and doesn't want the smoke, because I know for a fact that Luque would love that matchup right now. He's been calling for it for years, I feel like, since the start of this whole situation around the world with everyone sneezing synchronized around the world. I'm not going to say it because I might get demonetized. But with this whole sneezing situation around the world, since the beginning of it, Luque's been calling Nate Diaz his name. The UFC would really love to see Vicente Luque destroy Nate Diaz and then move on with his own career and use all of the star power that he's going to get from beating a guy like Nate Diaz to take into his own career and pay the UFC back by promoting one of their lesser-known contenders in the welterweight division. I feel as though if the UFC are going to give Nate Diaz to anyone, it's going to be a young up-and-comer who's got their career ahead of them, like what they did with Leon Edwards, a younger guy who needed a bit of a promotional boost, who needed a bit of star power. They've got that star power now, and they're making a title fight between him and Kamaru Usman now as well. I don't see the Ben Askren fight happening, but if it does happen, honestly, in MMA, I don't know about this current version of Ben Askren, but prime Ben Askren just easily beats Nate Diaz in MMA. I think he ragdolls him, stays on top of him, beats him up on the ground, chokes him out in a certain way, maybe dominates him for the entirety of the fight and doesn't finish him. Maybe he gets a decision over Nate Diaz. Watching Nate Diaz against guys like RDA, Benson Henderson, and other people that have been able to take him down and ground him out on the ground, I don't think it would be good for him to fight a guy like Ben Askren. Even in the Rory McDonald fight against a real welterweight in Rory McDonald, just chucked him around like he was absolutely nothing in that fight. Just chucked him around like a pathetic sack of soy boy shit all over the canvas, and Nate Diaz couldn't really do anything about the grappling. Now, he also had problems with the grappling against Leon Edwards, who's typically not an offensive grappler, because Edwards was taking him down, trying to take his back, but Nate Diaz would barely survive getting his back taken, work his way back up to his feet. I do feel like a prime Ben Askren would have a solid chance of taking down Nate Diaz and just riding him out for the entire fight long, because that's what Ben Askren did in his prime. But Nate Diaz, maybe right now in their careers, would probably find a way to beat Ben Askren, because Ben Askren is just so unathletic at this point in his career. So old, he's had his hip surgery, he's just been KO'd by Jake Paul. I'm sure he is not training hard right now whatsoever. I can almost assure you that he's done little to no training outside of his disc golf training over the past however many years it's been since he fought Jake Paul. I think about a year. It might not have even been a year, time flies, but even still, yeah, that fight could happen, I guess. But I do want to talk about this as well. Jake Paul versus Nate Diaz. People say things like, yeah, Nate Diaz got him shook. Yeah, Nate Diaz got him on the ropes here. There's no way Jake Paul wants to fight Nate Diaz. I'm telling you right now, Jake Paul thinks he can beat Nate Diaz. And I don't mind Jake Paul's chances of beating Nate Diaz either. So all of this, like, he'll never take on Nate, never a real fighter. He just beat Woodley in a boxing match. Woodley was a world champion. Nate Diaz was lucky to be ranked, okay? 20-12 is his record. In a boxing match, and this is another thing to take into consideration, Jake Paul controls everything. If you think that Jake Paul will go 8 rounds with Nate Diaz in a boxing match, and that's the terms he'll sign up for, he will not do that whatsoever, and you're really severely mistaken there. He will make it a 6-round bout, a 4-round bout. He'll fight Nate Diaz, and he'll probably beat Nate Diaz, who's picked up boxing 6 months. I know he's been boxing for his entire career, but I'd honestly lean the way of Jake Paul, especially if Jake Paul does get past Tommy Fury. I would definitely pick him to beat Nate Diaz. Although it'll be a tough fight, and maybe in an 8-rounder or a 12-rounder, Nate Diaz would eventually start to win. Jake Paul's not going to do that many rounds with him. He'll probably sign a 6-round bout with him and just beat him over the 6 rounds with better boxing, because he's been doing it for ages now. It's literally been about 4 years. He's actually kind of good at boxing. Let's move on to another topic. Dan Hooker is moving down to the 145-pound division. This is big for Dan Hooker. Listen, if you would have told me that Dan Hooker was moving a division, I would have said, oh, when's the Gilbert Burns rematch? That would be my first guess. Dan Hooker's moving division? Right, when's the Gilbert Burns rematch? He's already beat Gilbert Burns. Gilbert Burns is a top contender at welterweight who's beaten guys like Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. Dan Hooker destroyed Gilbert Burns in the first round. Surely if Dan Hooker was going to move division, as a big guy for lightweight anyway, he would consider the welterweight division, consider being fresher without as much as a weight cut, be a bit stronger, be a bit quicker than his opponents, and maybe deal with things up there. But I guess there's a lot of wrestlers right now at welterweight. Sean Brady, Kamaru Usman, Colby Covington, Gilbert Burns himself. He doesn't want to have to deal with the grapplers, I feel like. But moving down to featherweight, I know there's a lot of strikers there, and that's what he's seeing. He's seeing Brian Ortega, Yair Rodriguez. He's seeing Alexander Volkanovski, who does grapple, but he's predominantly a striker. Max Holloway, Calvin Kattar, Giga Chikadze, Zabit Magomedsharipov, the Korean Zombie, Arnold Allen, Sadiq Youssef, Edson Barboza. Like, you can go down the list. Dan Ige, Josh Emmett. None of them are going to grapple with you. None of them will. But the problem with Dan Hooker that he hasn't really taken into consideration here is, the problem with moving down to 45 is there is a wave of grapplers coming. And they are getting there. Topuria versus Evloev is up soon, okay? Bryce Mitchell's returning to the UFC soon after his injury. He's been out for a very long time. There are these grapplers that are starting to burst on the scene in the featherweight division that might be a problem for Dan Hooker. But let's go through some opponents that maybe he could take on and talk about why this is a story in the first place. On his Instagram, Dan Hooker posted 45 look alive, and he posted himself doing a test weight cut down to 145 pounds. He made 146 pounds, and this is very important because it shows how easy he can do it. This is not Dan Hooker in peak fight condition. This is Dan Hooker in reasonably good shape doing a test weight cut down to 146 pounds, and he made it. This is not Dan Hooker after a full training camp of getting in peak physical condition to where his muscle mass is perfect and his body fat percentage is as low as it possibly can get, and then he's doing a weight cut. So honestly, the 145 pound weight cut might not be too bad for Dan Hooker, and I could kind of see it coming that he would do a test to 145 when he mentioned that Alexander Volkanovski weighs more than he does at 55 when he fights at 45. When Alexander Volkanovski fought Brian Ortega at 145 pounds and Dan Hooker fought Nasrat Haqparast at 155 pounds, Volkanovski weighed more than Dan Hooker on fight day. And that's crazy to say. So maybe Dan Hooker's making a bit of a right move here. He'd be a big, rangy guy for the division. There are a lot of strikers there. Who should he take on first in that division? I'm looking immediately at Edson Barboza in a rematch. Because otherwise, if he takes on anyone else, he's going to be placed below Edson Barboza in the rankings because he's new to the division. He doesn't really have too many great wins. Remember, he did take on Yair Rodriguez before in his career and lost to him by unanimous decision. Had some close fights here and there with other guys. Like, I think he even lost to Jason Knight at one point in his career. This was a different Dan Hooker, though. But still, I think if he wants to jump right ahead of the queue, Edson Barboza's looking for a bout right now. And if you were to make Edson Barboza versus Dan Hooker at 145... on the pay-per-view card in February where Adesanya fights Robert Whittaker, you could open up the card with Dan Hooker versus Edson Barboza 2. It was a fun scrap the first time that led to a one-sided domination as the rounds went on for Edson Barboza. Let's remake that fight. See if Dan Hooker's improved enough to beat Edson Barboza. He probably won't like the idea of that rematch, but I'm telling you, if you don't want to be held behind Barboza in the rankings, you got to take him out now. Take out Edson Barboza, get ranked near the top 10 of the featherweight division, and put yourself and establish yourself in a new division. But then again, what's the problem here? Because Volkanovski's the champ in that division. I guess Riddell's coming up at lightweight, and Dan Hooker kind of doesn't want to be in the way. But Volkanovski is still there at featherweight, and I don't see him losing the belt anytime soon, so this could lead to a bit of a clash if Dan Hooker does start doing well. I think Dan Hooker can compete in the featherweight division. Like, if he was to call out Alex Caceres, I would pick him to beat Alex Caceres. It would be a tough matchup. I'm sure it would be reasonably competitive and close, but I'd pick Dan Hooker quite comfortably to beat a guy like Alex Caceres. I don't mind his chances against a guy like Shane Burgos in a war. I don't mind his chances against Dan Ige with a knee up the middle. I don't mind his chances against Josh Emmett with a knee up the middle either. Like, there's a lot of opponents that Dan Hooker could take on and reasonably have a solid chance of beating at featherweight, but I just don't understand why the answer is to drain yourself. Doesn't make any sense to me. Why drain yourself? Maybe he could take on Sadiq Youssef, though. Striker, really weak chin, terrible chin for the featherweight division. Maybe Dan Hooker could KO Sadiq Youssef at some point. There are so many matchups for Dan Hooker at 145. I like the idea of a switch up of a division, and it would be cool to have Dan Hooker's name in amongst the Ortegas, the Rodriguezes, the Korean Zombies, the Holloways and the Volkanovskis of the featherweight division. We'll see how far he can go. Looking forward to this move. It's always good to get a nice little new look at things if you're doing badly at one division. I just thought maybe he'd move up to 170, but no. 145 it is for Dan Hooker, and I'm excited to see what he does next. February, main card pay-per-view opener, Dan Hooker versus Edson Barboza or Sadiq Youssef. Make one of those fights happen. Moving on to something else, which is UFC 268 pay-per-view numbers have been revealed. Colby Covington is a giant draw for the UFC. This is what this tells me. They sold 700,000 pay-per-view buys. If you don't know, That was more than Israel Adesanya versus Vettori 2, which had Nate Diaz on the card, and that was a huge fight night card, or a huge pay-per-view card that should have sold a lot more pay-per-views, and it only did 600k, and they had a great press conference. Now, something else to take into consideration with these 700,000 pay-per-view buys was that this was on the same night as Canelo's fight. You know what I mean? With Plant, and that was a big fight for boxing. So I feel like if Canelo versus Plant wasn't on this weekend, it probably would have sold 800,000 pay-per-view buys, 850,000 pay-per-view buys, something along those lines, which tells us Covington brings in the fucking money for the UFC. And that's why they gave him pay-per-view shares in his last fight, which he did get, by the way, apparently. According to the payouts, Colby Covington gets a percentage of the pay-per-view shares, about 5%. If you look up the payouts of UFC 268, you'll see a pay-per-view revenue share listed in Covington's graph. There's like a graph they show where it like shows which you got paid for, your win bonus, your show money, your Venom sponsorship, your fight week incentive pay, and then whatever else you get if it's pay-per-view shares. Covington had like a solid chunk of money in that pay-per-view share area, so he definitely gets a share of the pay-per-views, but this just shows that what he does works for the UFC. 700,000 pay-per-view buys. It was a good card, UFC 268, but it wasn't like a... It didn't have crazy star power on it. You know what I mean? Gaethje versus Chandler was a big fight. They have got some star power, but it's not like a McGregor's on the card or a Nate Diaz is on the card or something like that. But it is Gaethje versus Chandler. Big fight on the card. Burgos versus Quarantillo. It's a good fight, but it's not going to add any pay-per-view buys. Edgar versus Vera. Good fight. Maybe you get like 10,000 Ecuadorians that are going to buy the pay-per-view now as well. That can add on as well, but this is only American-based buyers, by the way, 700,000. Namajunas versus Zhang 2. No one was really amped up for the rematch. It shouldn't have happened anyway. The rematch made no sense. Doesn't really add too much value to the card. Usman himself, and I'll give him credit for this, is becoming his own star. Regardless of how shit his personality is, and no one likes him for his personality, he still puts on good performances, and he shows up often enough to be a recognisable name for the casual fan. So people know who Usman is, plus he got the brutal KO over Masvidal, so his stock was higher than ever. He's going to bring some of that revenue, but no doubt in my mind, if that sold 700,000 pay-per-view buys, at least 500k of them are to do with Covington. At least 450k of them are to do with Colby Covington selling for that pay-per-view because he made the press conference amazing. The build-up was amazing as well. The fight itself was amazing. The whole reason the fight was anticipated was because how good Covington did the first time against Kamaru Usman. I know. I like Covington's star power. And I think he should definitely do the Ultimate Fighter with Masvidal next. It's perfect. And this should be evidence of that for the UFC. Listen, we didn't like Colby at first. He's just sold 700,000 pay-per-views for us. Not sold them on his own, but he added a lot to a pay-per-view card and made it a big selling pay-per-view card because of his antics. Let's put him on the Ultimate Fighter against Jorge Masvidal. And this honestly tells me, if I was a matchmaker for the UFC, I'm spitting everywhere right now because I'm excited about this. This tells me I can have Covington versus Masvidal headline a pay-per-view card. Covington Usman, the beef is there, but it's not the storyline that Covington and Masvidal have. If they do Covington versus Masvidal as a pay-per-view headliner, I'm sure there was a worry in their mind that maybe, because they were both coming off losses, the stock wouldn't be high enough to sell a good pay-per-view card. But they're wrong. The fact that you can sell this many on a good card, don't get me wrong, means that with a great undercard, they could do the Ultimate Fighter and Covington versus Masvidal as the main event of their own pay-per-view in June of next year. Get it done immediately. Put all your stars on the undercard as well. Sean O'Malley, Taito Ivasa, Paddy Pimblett, all of the big names that you want to promote. Put them on the undercard of the main card and let's make that pay-per-view happen. Covington versus Masvidal next. Go. Like and subscribe. Thank you for watching. Click that button up there. Toodle pip. I'll see you later. Goodbye.